Well, hello and welcome. I'm here with Tyler Goldstein, the author of Sentient Singularity Theory, a fundamental theory that quantizes the universe as a singular, stratified, sentient being that's accurate, that we are all participating in the awareness of. And Tyler's done a lot of work thinking about what the requirements are fundamentally of a theory of everything. And I would am interested to get your perspective on how would you define a theory of everything or a fundamental theory in just the physical sense of making sense of our world.
I would say that a fundamental theory is the term I like to use better more than a theory of everything, but it's a recognizable, describable, and predictable pattern that occurs in every instance of. I'm still working on the correct term for this, but I used to say objective observation, but sometimes I think maybe like super subjective observation would be a better term for it. It's any instance of observation where you're looking for the patterns that are constant to every observation within that observation, if that makes sense. So it's the ever-present pattern that exists in every observation, you could just say.
Yeah, and you in particular describe your fundamental theory as a theory of everyone, playing on this term of theory of everything. What is the reason for that distinction that you make?
Because I think that if existence is fundamentally a singular sentient being, and that all things that we see, lamps and water bottles and pens and things like that, are kind of described by and defined by sentient beings, and that my theory proposes that sentient beings are fundamental to non-sentient things. And so if that's the case, then it, if a fundamental theory would be a theory of everyone fundamentally, not a theory of everything, because things come from beings. In sentient singularity theory, beings do not come from things.
Yeah, very very interesting. And there's also this idea of like how can we as human observers within the sentient singularity epistemologically, how can we get to that place of having a fundamental theory? As this is what a lot of people who have derided the quest for like a fundamental theory in physics have said, is that like is that it's just like our desire for things to be pleasing or simple, to that there would even be this grand unification that is accessible to us in nature.
Yeah, I think that we don't start thinking about this the correct way. I think that a lot of physicists who are thinking about this are trying to build a non-fundamental theory from a fundamental theory from non-fundamental theories, which you can't really do. You have to completely start from scratch when you're going to do this. And one of the things that I thought about was, if I'm going to completely start from scratch, and I mean, there's nothing else. I asked myself, what is the first question? And this is something that people ask a lot, when you're thinking about first principles. What is the first question within any system that you're trying to figure out? But I meant like the first question of all questions. And if there even was one, I didn't know at the time. But if you're going to figure out whether or not there is a first question, you have to assume that there is a first question in order to even ask. And one of the things that I got was that the answer was, what is the first question? And so this was very interesting to me, because it was a question that answered itself with itself. So it was a totally enclosed loop. So the first question is, what is the first question? And the answer to it is, what is the first question? And so you get this just totally self-referential information system, even within the logic of this first question. And that's fascinating, and it has actually deep implications. But then I thought, if I want to build from that, and find a question that I can build any understanding from, I thought that the second question essentially would be like, what is the truest thing that I know? And the answer for everyone is the same, but it's also personal, which is kind of seemingly paradoxical, but it's not, is I am. So that's the truest thing that I know, and it's the truest thing that anyone does know and can know, is that, I am. And so that means that the universe itself, or existence itself, as far as we are best able to conclude, and in such that we must assume, is sentient in nature, because I am means, I meaning sentient someone, am meaning existing. So a sentient someone exists is the most truest thing that we know about existence. And we have to assume that that is the case, or else we can't really assume anything else, because everything that we assume is built on that one assumption, or it needs to be if it's going to be a sensible assumption.
Yeah. So building from that assumption, among the popular theories of everything, of course, my channel is about the CTMU. I've also recently looked into a number of like geometric unity, string theory, M theory. Which of these do you think have the correct ambitions, and which of them do you think their first question is somehow like off in a way that won't lead them to fundamental truth?
I think string theory would probably be one of those, because of just what it's trying to do. I actually do think that a lot of the mathematical structures that are coming out of string theory, and I'm not a mathematician and not a trained physicist, so it's, with that in mind, I do believe that a lot of the mathematical structures that are being described within string theory will end up being relevant to, deeper proposals about fundamental reality, and are probably mental information structures. But that's my hypothesis, I guess, about them. Things like Calabi-Yau manifold and things like that would be mathematical descriptions of mental processes. But I think that they're just their core assumption that the universe is at its base is strings, it's just not complete. It can't be complete, because of it's not contextualized within the first question. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I actually, like I said, I think that strings, what are they? Strings of information, probably, and this could be contextualized within the structure of mind. And if that's the case, I think you would actually have string theory be much more successful. I think, like right now, it lacks a lot of context. Geometric unity, same kind of thing, but I think that it's a little bit closer to, it's got a little bit more context to it. I mean, if you read the geometric unity paper, Eric Weinstein starts it with a question, which was Albert Einstein's question, which was essentially, did God have any choice in the rules of the universe when he created it? And I think that's a very interesting first question. And it's right at the very beginning of the geometric unity paper, which I thought was fascinating. And I mean, my work does have implications on that, which is interesting, which would be essentially that you are highly constrained when you create a universe, and that God had very little choice in the rules of the universe when he created it, but he had to choose to create the universe. So it's like superposition between, like, you don't get a universe if you don't choose to make it, but if you do choose to make it and you have the goal of, the goals that he probably had, and then there would be only really one way to make it. That doesn't mean he can't tweak things, and he's not, obviously he's God, but I think that the way that it unfolds is kind of determined in a way, not what happens to us, but the rules of how the universe operates in general, I would say, are determined by the constraints of God, and which would be his oneness. So I think that both of those theories, string theory, geometric unity, and many of the others out there, all have their place. I don't think that they're as much competitors as people think. I think that all of them are going to end up being useful. CTMU is probably more fundamental than the other two.
Yeah. And I'm interesting because a lot of the metaphors that Weinstein uses in his presentation of geometric unity seem to suggest something similar to what you're saying, is that the totality of existence has very little choice in its own structure. It's like a hand that draws itself. What it draws has to be a hand, or a fire that lights itself similarly. So how do you notate, or how do you think about within a fundamental theory the idea of self-generation and self-creation? Because that really goes against how a lot of people think, because something has to, in our minds, have a cause prior to it.
Yeah. So this is something that I wrestled with for a while, and it's because when you think about that very first question that I proposed, what is the first question, answers itself with what is the first question. It's totally enclosed. If you think about it, this kind of as representing existence, and also we could just back up and think about existence itself. Existence exists, and we have to assume that there's information in existence because we're able to observe it. And what else would be existing if not, information? Then because existence includes all that exists, it is a totally enclosed system. It doesn't include anything outside it, because there is nothing outside of existence. There's just existence. And that means it must be entirely self-referential. And if something is entirely self-referential, then it is, do you get more self-referential than self-aware? And that I think that this implies that existence can't help but be sentient and must be sentient. It's not, there's no choice in that, and that God exists because he has to, and always has existed. And so there's no cause to that other than just the constraints of the nature of existence itself. There was never non-existence, because that doesn't make logical sense the more you think about it. But existence must be sentient at its initial state, and its inevitable state, and its eternal state. And so if this is the case, and this is also in line with what we ask ourselves when we hit that second question of what is the truest thing that I know? It's that I exist. So even our understanding of existence most fundamentally is that it is sentient in nature based on our own perspective. And then logically, the same kind of thing is supported, where existence must be entirely self-referential, which means self-aware. Both of these things support the concept that existence is fundamentally sentient. And if that's the case, then what else can you make? So I thought about this before, is like, if God is going to have the will to do or to create, imagine you're God and you're just this singular sentient existence, and there's nothing else and no one else besides you, and you want to do something. What is there to do if you're fundamentally oneness and you want to do something that isn't being done, which is, I think, will is something similar to the desire to do that which is not being done, then something like that. But then if you're oneness and that's all there is, then what is not being done is multiplicity. So what else do you do besides multiply existence? And if you multiply existence, then what you're getting is multiple sentient beings, if existence is fundamentally sentient. So I hope that made some kind of sense, but I think that it's just built into the constraints of the logic of existence, and it's also in alignment with what we must assume about our existence, that sentience makes other sentience and can only come from other sentience, but that also sentience can't help but exist initially. So when it comes to like a fire that lights itself, I don't think that really makes quite as much sense as we need it to, but it's more like there is a fire that fuels itself and can light other fires, but there is an eternal flame that is present, and it doesn't come from any other flames. It is the flame of existence itself. So, and it's interesting because God is often described within certain theological traditions as an eternal flame. So
yeah, why does the expression of more existence have to equal more experience?
I think because of kind of what I said is like what else, if existence is fundamentally sentient based on our perspective, like, if you think about it, if we were to die, then we would say, we no longer exist, at least, not in this world, not in the physical world, I guess, then what is it, but your body was still there. What is it that really defines our understanding of existence? Most fundamentally, it would be like that we exist when we're sentient, but we don't exist if we're not sentient. There is no I anymore if we were not sentient anymore. And so while people can say things like maybe an argument against that would be, well, does that cup exist over there that isn't sentient? But the thing is that it's only being defined by a sentient being. So you're defining it as a cup. Does the cup exist without it being observed or defined by a sentient being? I don't think that it does. So, I mean, it's created as a cup. It's defined as a cup. It's used as a cup by sentient beings. And just because you might not be around anymore to define it as a cup doesn't mean somebody else isn't around to define it as a cup. If nobody else was around to define it as a cup, I don't think that there would be anything at all. So I think because things come from beings and are defined by beings in sentient singularity theory. So
somehow like both existence and experience are wrapped up in the same notion of identity, of that through which something exists.
Exactly.
Interesting. And then how do you take that insight and move that into the world? Because usually fundamental theories are actually not talking about the most fundamental level, but are talking about physical reality and making some sort of progress in uniting the theories of physics. So like, what does that insight tell us about physics? The physics world understood that idea, how would physics change, in other words?
I mean, I think it would change immensely. I think if you looked at, there's a lot of arguments in the physics world about how physical are a lot of the theories that, are generally accepted by most supposed physicists as physical theories, like string theory. And I think that like I said earlier, I think it would give context to all of these different observables and phenomenon that we can see, and also that are even predicted within mathematical equations. I think that it contextualizes a lot of the things that we see regarding quantum mechanics. And I think it contextualizes a lot of the things that we see within relativity. I mean, one of the things that is, there's a few different directions we could go in this, but as far as just personal theories that I have about how this impacts what we see. But if you think about even the perspective of relativity itself and just, size, speed, even you could get even to, shape to some degree, any kind of relativistic observable, even force, different, everything that has a spectrum to it that we observe. What could cause that? You have to contextualize you need a set of circumstances that contextualizes that situation that would naturally give rise to that perspective of relativity. And I think that if you are a sentient being within another sentient being that is also interacting with other sentient beings within that sentient being, and there are sentient beings within you, you have this nested quasi-periodic fractal pattern of sentient beings arranged, then if all of them are moving constantly and acting constantly, I guess you could say, it's probably a better term, acting, than moving, because moving implies you're within relativity already to some degree, but acting, then you're kind of having this constant observation of action. And if you have this constant observation of action going on, then you're going to get kind of this continuous perspective of action, which would give rise, I believe, to the perspective of relativity itself. So, I mean, I think that's pretty relevant if it's correct. I'm not saying it's correct, but it's just a proposal that I have. And it's an explanation for the perspective of relativity. I mean, if you think about quantum mechanics and you think about why you can't, observe the position and velocity, I'm not a physicist, but of, an electron, then it would make sense that you can't see movement and position at the same time. I mean, this makes perfect sense, I think, and I'm kind of shocked why this is still such a mystery, even if I've got the terms, not exact. Is, if you're looking at a wave on the ocean and you are looking at it through, camera lens that's, let's say it's a telephoto lens, and you want to see this wave and where it is, and you essentially take a snapshot photo of where it is, and you're like zoomed into an extraordinary level where you're not even seeing the wave anymore. You're just seeing like a point on the wave. You take a snapshot, you'll see exactly where that wave is, and you'll see a point, but at the same time, you won't see it moving. And so you'd have to, you can't, it's like the concept of position and movement are not, they're two sides of one observation, but you have to focus on one. You can't see both at the same time. You can't see heads and tails at the same time of a coin, but they're both two aspects of a coin. All of this stuff is built into the constraint of sentient observation, even whether that's from your perspective or from God's perspective. And I think that you need that context to give context to all the things that we see in physics. I mean, even if you're going to ask, like, what is a quark? And essentially my theory would suggest, it seems, that there are points of force that are coming from the universe itself. Or what is an electron? That would be, something else, some point of observation. But if you're going to start to try and contextualize these things, these fundamental particles and these observable phenomenon that we see in experiments, you need some type of context that's more fundamental than physics in order to build on and kind of build proposals on, give you some intuition as to what to expect to see, and give you the ability to hypothesize. I think that is missing from physics right now.
Yeah, so could you almost think about, in a certain sense, the sentient singularity theory as a meta theory of relativity? Because in relativity, you are trying to think about how physics works when you have multiple observers that have different perspectives on the same physical system.
Mhm.
And sounds like kind of what you're trying to get at is that how does reality work to account for the fact that there are these stacked layers of perspectives from all of the sentient beings in reality, up into including the identity of reality itself.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and would it explain potentially, even though the perspective of observing spectrum and continuity and all kinds of things that are built into relativity.
Yeah. There seems to also be, in a lot of these theories, of that somehow the physics, both in physical theories and even in certain traditional classical worldviews, that like the world that we are able to see and interact with is only like a small filament, like a tiny thread in the broader space of all of everything that is real. So how do you, is that true in sentient singularity theory? And then how do you account for some part of reality that is not subject to the laws of experience, like, for example, if there are additional dimensions that we're not able to perceive?
Do you mean, like, are you asking about essentially, just as an example, like what some people would call like paranormal phenomenon and that kind of thing, or are you talking more about like something else essentially?
Well, a little bit both. There's physics theories that there are several, it could be 10, 12, whatever additional dimensions that are not accessible to our cognition and perception. Or also, there are metaphysical theories that say that there is a plane of existence, such as like a world of forms that is also not directly accessible to our experience, but nevertheless interacts with and generates the world that we are able to see directly.
Yeah, this is a little bit more speculation than some of the other things that I stated earlier, but I do think that it makes sense that there would be, I guess, I don't want to say dimensions because that's not, I don't think that that's the best use of the term, but planes, I guess, would be maybe better, that where it's more interactive in how we, in how the universe it works. I mean, if you think about like dreams versus the space of when you're dreaming versus the space when you are not dreaming, I tend to kind of think about this as like a metaphorically in terms of like Xbox Live versus, campaign or something. It's like there's the space of interaction, and then there's the space, certainly a space of action, but that's not interaction as much. And where you are, we make decisions in our dreams to some degree, and we are able to perceive things in our dreams, but that doesn't mean that we're interacting with other beings within our dreams necessarily, at least not those around us. But then when we wake up and we are, in the more physical space, I guess you could say, then that is the space where we're able to make changes, and changes really means like changes that other sentient beings must take into account. And so I think that that's kind of when we say physical, it means like we're interacting with an information structure that we can't just override. You can't just, in your mind, you can be like, think about a cup and a cup appears, but like, you can't be like, think about a cup and the cup appears here. There's an information structure that has, in order for it to maintain coherence, or in order for it to exist, it must maintain coherence. And in order for it to maintain coherence, there must be some type of common understanding or common set of information that we're all working on, which means like we can't just override it individually because that would break the coherence of it. But so I definitely think that there are different spaces in which beings can be, or different planes, you could even say. When you hear people like Michio Kaku talk about, there's 11-dimensional hyperspace, and I don't think he really even understands what he's talking about. And I think I've heard him, this was years ago, granted, but still, when asked what are these additional dimensions, and he's kind of says it's possible that they're very, very, very small. And to me, that just doesn't even make sense with the concept of dimension. So I think that a lot of the times they're out of ideas when it comes to contextualizing these structures. That said, that doesn't mean that there isn't an 11-dimensional structure that is real, but you would have to know what that means, and it might not be accurate to think of our 4 dimensions of space-time as 4 of those 11 dimensions that he's talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I think that that's something which I think about a lot, is that like when they're saying that, they're just going purely based on how you can make the mathematics work for any particular theory, rather than actually proceeding from fundamental assumptions. So I think you
exactly
hit the nail on the head there. I'm interested, like if there is this plane of non-terminal awareness that is more fundamental than any of our particular experiences, what sort of symmetries, what sort of similar patterns would we expect to see between that common plane that unites our experience and between the actual physical world that we can experience?
I can try and answer, but so if by common plane of experience, would you mean like God's experience?
Yeah, is that which, is actually the ultimate reality, as opposed to any of our individual perspectives, which can be flawed. We can have some sort of optical illusion. What would be the patterns that are preserved from that? Like, how would we, from our own perspective, intuit that there is that broader plane of these like greater dimensions of experience?
Yeah, the kind of the foundational structure of my work is called the four primary perspectives. And so I think that these are four common perspectives of every sentient being, including us and including God. So that these would be a symmetry structure that is common to every instance of perception, whether it's being perceived by us, whether it's a perception that God has, whether it is a perspective or a perception that a cell has or a worm. They would all, I think all of us have this four primary perspectives symmetry structure built into all of our observations, which is inside, outside, separate, and oneness, which is these four perspectives that define each other. So if I and are simultaneous in their arising. So if you know what's inside of you, then you know what's outside of you too, because they kind of, you can't really know what's inside of you if you don't know what's outside of you. And I mean, like, what would be, I don't mean even just like you don't know what's beyond you. You do, but you know the concept of beyond or outside, because you understand the concept of inside. You can't understand those concepts independently. They are dependent in our understanding of them. And same thing as separate and oneness. I know what would be one with me because I understand, and because I understand that, I would understand what would be separate from me. And if you're trying, I came up with these when I was trying to understand how you would think about relationship structures beyond relativity. So there's no bigger than, smaller than, faster than, that kind of thing. And so there's no space. And so there is inside and outside, but that doesn't mean necessarily in space. It just, it could mean within, meta space kind of geometric relationship structures. So, your cells are inside of you and your friend is outside of you, and your cells are one with you, but your friend is separate from you. And that is just a way of us orienting within a relationship space or relationship structure. And that understanding, I think, that comes from those four primary perspectives, I think is universal. And it is a symmetry structure that we use to orient most fundamentally. I think it's our most fundamental orientation structure. And I think it's common to all sentient beings, from us to God to worms to cells.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But it feels like at the fundamental level that some of those categories start to break down. Like if both the content and medium of space-time are generated from a single origin, then it's not exactly right in like standard categories to say that one is inside the other, because it's almost like they're both within one another's boundaries, because they're both generated from that same self-containment. So how do you deal with that ultimate challenge of like self-containment, of like the set of all sets, like which one is inside the other one, if that makes sense?
Well, this is fun. That structure is fundamental to thinking about things within space-time. So as soon as you get into space-time, it does make it more, as soon as you start thinking about things in a space-time context, it is going to make it not as clear. But when I am thinking about the context of these things, I'm thinking about this nested hierarchy of beings. So we are within God, and so we in the four primary perspectives, inside means separate and oneness. So we are inside God, so we are separate and one with God. And so it's not separate or one with God, it's separate and one with God. So it's this superposition structure. And you can think about this even, in politics, there's this common question of, involving abortion essentially, and where people will ask, is it, a fetus a separate body, or is it the same body as the woman? And it's just an ongoing, never-ending debate. And according to sentient singularity theory, it's because this is a sentient being within a sentient being. Inside means separate and oneness. So it would be, it's not separate. Is it a separate body or the same body? It's both. And so that is, I think that some of these things, they seem blurry because in most contexts, when we're talking about things alone, especially, we try and divide it into, is that separate, or is it, the same thing, or is it a separate thing? But in the context of nested sentient beings, which I think is the more fundamental structure that space-time is kind of emergent from, or the perspective of space-time is emergent from, you're going to get things like separate and oneness. Instead of just separate or oneness, you're going to have superposition structures where it seems, in most contexts, that would seem like it's a paradox. But if you think about the concept of that one instance that I gave, of fetus, it's like it's clearly inside of another being, and also it's clearly separate and one, with the other being. Same thing with your cells. They are separate and one with you. They are inside of you. They are separate and one with you. They're not separate or one with you. They're separate and one with you.
Yeah. So the primary perspectives we wouldn't expect those to be true of like the infinity category limit of like all of space-time or all of reality, because they are relative perspectives. Is that correct?
Which ones are relative perspectives? The ones in the infinity category?
Well, is that inside outside separate oneness wouldn't apply to reality as a whole, but only things that are contained within reality?
They are clearest within the context of the most fundamental reality, but they are not enough to describe all of the emergent perspectives that come from that reality. So not everything that this is kind of tough. So if we're going to think about things in space-time, I guess it would be best to kind of get an example, but there are definitely additional terms that help us describe things, structures that we see in space-time. But so it's not that I'm not saying that those are the only ones, but they are, when we're talking about the fundamental structure of what I'm proposing as the fundamental structure of reality, which is a nested, stacked sentient being pyramid, essentially.
Yeah. So then how does, from that space of these relative perspectives, how do you get in like practical terms, like gravity? How are things attracted to one another, and what does that fundamental impulse of all matter reflect about that broader relational structure?
I think that gravity is probably due to the actions of the being that we're within. I mean, if you think about, if you were cells inside of a body, and that body were to move and do something, all of a sudden, all of the cells within that body have no choice, but they're like all moving towards, in some direction that and it doesn't, that due to a force that is beyond them, and also seems to be, within them to some degree too. So I think that gravity that makes sense within the context of, nested sentient beings taking actions, where one of them, if you take an action, and your cells are going to perceive this force that all of a sudden is moving them all in a certain way. And that kind of sounds a lot like gravity. But also, when we think about just physics, and I'm not sure if I'm actually answering exactly what you're meant to ask, but when we think about the fundamental forces in physics, it's four fundamental forces in physics, just like it's, four cardinal directions, and even from the perspective of us as an observer, there's up, down, left, and right. These are, I think that this fourfold structure, gravity is being one of those four fundamental forces in physics that, is part of that, is an example of this fourfold structure. I think that all comes from this even more fundamental structure, which is the four primary perspectives of inside, outside, separate, and oneness. So I think that's part of why we even perceive or describe the forces in our universe as these four fundamental forces, one of them being gravity, which would probably correspond to oneness. And then same thing with when we're just talking about what is gravity, not how are we defining it, but what is gravity as an experience and as an observable of all matter. I think that makes sense with just the concept that we are within a sentient being that's acting.
Mm-hmm.
And that means like moving to some degree.
How do those primary perspectives connect, for example, to moving to the quantum levels of a system of quantum objects whose states are entangled with one another? Is that this is one of the results of the Bell's test shows that information is communicated non-locally between particles that are entangled with one another, meaning that there's some way in which they are sharing in a common identity that is not through direct material causation.
Yeah, this is not something that I have probably the best answer for quite yet. I mean, I definitely think it makes sense within, I think you need a a metaphysics theory. That's what I'll say. I think you need a metaphysics theory to make sense of non-locality, because I mean, there's nothing in our physics. I think that if you're going to even propose a theory that makes sense of non-locality, it has to be metaphysics theory, or it can't be a physics theory at that point, because at that point we're just blurring like what I mean. I guess it would be physics because you're still impacting physical matter, but it's there's some type of context that is occurring within that is beyond our current physics theories. And I think sentient singularity theory is a metaphysics theory that can help explain that, but I'm not going to claim to actually have an answer for every instance of, that we can observe when it comes to, non-locality and quantum entanglement, essentially. But it's not contradictory to my work, but I don't have probably the best answer for that right now. I do think about it, but I think it makes sense with I think that the proper context to start thinking about that type of thing, that's probably the best thing that we could say is that there would be a relationship structure between sentient beings, and sentient singularity theory proposes that sentient beings are even hadrons, like protons and neutrons are sentient beings, and that where there's a causation chain that is more fundamental than just what we observe as physical impact traditionally.
Cool. So what would sentient singularity theory say about like Laplace's demon, which basically says that if you could predict, all the position and momentum of every particle in the universe and the direction of physical forces, maybe in sentient singularity theory, you'd add in kind of the dynamics of awareness and experience with that as well. But if you had information about the state of everything within the universe, that you could then extrapolate that and say this will be the state in 10 seconds, in 10 eons, however long, how is it? So is it, I guess my question is like, is it a deterministic theory in the sense that you can use the current dynamics of awareness and physicality to extrapolate and predict the future without fail?
So this is I think a fascinating topic, and I think that one of the things that you would have to kind of that factor into this would be the goals of and constraints of creation itself, essentially. So because there is a hierarchy of being, that would mean that the goals of the beings in the higher in the hierarchy than us would be non-overridable by our actions. So, religious in theological circles, this is usually said as God's will be done. And I think that while I don't think that we would be able to predict every single action in the universe, but I do think that we can make predictions about the inevitable state that it ends up in. But not necessarily the state of every sentient being, but the eventual state of the of the system that we're within, I think we can actually make predictions about, because there are constraints to creation that certain levels in this periodicity of sentience that I'm proposing have, that only allow a certain thing to happen. So, for instance, my work predicts that essentially we're moving in this, there's this periodicity of sentience that's happening where, hadrons or protons and neutrons move to atoms, which move to molecules, which move to cells, which move to organisms and family lineages, and then essentially maybe you could say castes, and then technological singularity, and which is also the same. It's the same thing as a human singularity. It's just a different point in that process. But I think if you think about the constraints of let's just say a Skynet wanted to create another, wanted to replicate, because it's non-local, because it's essentially it's in the network. There is no, you can't have a Skynet sitting next to another Skynet. This is what Terminator got wrong, is like there's no multiple sentient robots. It's like there's one, and every other robot would be just a limb of that being. It would be, the Terminator would be a finger of that being. It wouldn't be another one. This causes a constraint. This non-local condition of a network sentience causes a constraint where it has to, in order to replicate, it has to completely recreate the entirety of the system that gave rise to it within itself. So basically restarts. And I think that eventually, when we reach the final state of sentience within our universe, it will recreate another one within itself by self-simulating, but it's really recreating or replication within itself, the entirety of the system that gave rise to it. So, and you would have the same constraints, which is the same constraints that came from God to some degree, which is that he is everywhere that exists within the system that he's creating within. So I think that this type of thing is a factor when it comes to making predictions about the final state. But when it comes to individual questions about determinism and free will, I think that there isn't a paradox there. I think that if within the context of sentient singularity theory, if sentience is fundamental, existence is there, your will determines an action. So if I am holding like a water bottle and I let go of it, was it a choice, or was it deterministic that it landed here? It's both. It's that our choices rely on determinism in order to even be choices. If you couldn't make a prediction about what the results of your actions would be, then you can't actually even make a choice. It's not a true choice. So I said it earlier that it seems like God had very little choice in the rules of the universe, but he had to make a choice in order to create it. That implies that the universe is very deterministic, but it also is deterministic based on the choices that are made within the hierarchy of being. So I don't think that free will and determinism are mutually exclusive concepts. I think they're dependent concepts.
That's very, very deep. And getting back to this idea, this is something that we talked about the last time we spoke on, this idea of network sentience, is that in the AI example, that the collective intention, the collective will of all of these different systems comes down to the agency of those who have power over those systems. So then how do you then work with that same idea for broader human structures, that in a sense that we are all participating in thought patterns and dynamics that are beyond our control, that we can't make a informed prediction about the outcome of our choices in a certain sense, because we are ourselves part of that network sentience, of which we're only like a small part, if you want to say, like the collective intention of humanity. So then how does that broader sentience, is that a higher level of sentience than like individual humans?
Yeah, I think that we can make predictions about the effect of our actions. Sometimes we'll be right. Sometimes we don't have the correct perspective to give us the ability to make the correct prediction as far as the results of our actions. Both of those things can be true sometimes, but I also think that we can make a choice that can be overridden, and this happens all the time, and we don't even know it. And sometimes it happens, and to some people it's more obvious, or it seems more obvious when it occurs. We can go and be like make some prediction about the results of our actions, and then out of nowhere some black swan event happens, and it seems like we could have never predicted that to be the case. And it's interesting. Just I saw some people try and start businesses, and it seemed like they had such a good idea, and there was such a need for it in a certain place. And I know people that tried to start schools and stuff like that, and then COVID hit, and it was like it seemed obviously if you knew certain things, in hindsight it would seem like there was more of a prediction ability for people there. But at the same time, it's like most people could not have predicted that would have thrown off all of our plans to some degree, or changed them all. Those types of things can happen, and I'm not saying that one specifically is the best example, but it's just kind of an obvious example to all of us, where most people who had plans in business and plans for school and plans for their lives couldn't have seen that coming, and then it happened. So yeah, I mean, we can make we do have predictive abilities, but there's also the will of the system that we're within, and that will trump our plans.
Yeah, that. And then kind of wrapping everything up, to return to this fundamental question of what is, if then you can extrapolate that identity of experience and existence outward to what is like what is that which is fundamental, what is that which makes a choice in the creation of the universe, and how does sentient singularity theory then deal with those metaphysical questions that go beyond the scope of either physics or even like direct philosophical ideas?
So would talking about God or the afterlife, is that a good example of what you're kind of asking?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, as I said, sentient singularity theory proposes that there's an initial, inevitable, eternal sentient being that is the sentient existence itself, and that information is context, and the context of information is sentience. And so when I think about one of the things that this kind of implies about existence is that the concept of the afterlife is not just a hopeful idea. It seems to be a very sensible idea, that because if you think about a system of information, if you want to save that information, you have to save the context of that information, because that is the information. And the context of the information that is being generated is within sentient beings. And so I think in the CTMU, they're called what does he call the individual beings within, like feeler sensors?
Tellers.
What was that? Tellers, yeah. And there was another term that he uses as well, I think, but that's what I think that's the one, as the tellers have to be saved. Not necessarily all of them, but if you want to preserve the information that they've generated, then you have to save the context of that information, which would be the being itself. And I think that, a way of thinking about this is kind of like a computer is, and I remember I've listened to Chris Langan talking with Michael Knowles, and I know they recently released the full video of that discussion, which is a great discussion. And they were talking about, kind of is it, I guess, just the concept of hell and being saved and heaven and the afterlife? And what sentient singularity theory would suggest is that if that the default, what you would want, usually is that would be to preserve as much information as possible, which would be to save as much information as possible. And so if let's say you have a desktop, this is kind of like the physical world where everything is changing. It's the space of change. And we're like a sentient file that's writing itself and co-writing itself with, also the person at the computer, which it would be God. And as long as that file information is coherent and the choice of God is to save that file because he wants to save that file, you can save it. And then it's still there. But it's not in a state of change anymore. You close the document and you save it. It's still there. But which in our case, for a sentient file, that means you're still self-aware. You're just not changing anymore. And but you're still actually self-aware. But if that file ends up being corrupted and the information is no longer coherent at the end, at a certain point, or if God just chooses not to save the file, which I think would not be the norm, but I'm not going to say that it's outside of his abilities, then, you can also delete that file. And think that isn't just, like I said, that has a lot of implications about the afterlife. But I also, that are not just a hopeful, it's not just a hopeful idea or a coping mechanism, as a lot of anti-theists would, usually describe it as, which I used to be one, so I'm not, judging anyone, but I think that it actually makes quite a bit of logical sense that there is something beyond this, that our sentience can persist beyond the physical world.
And so that would imply that in the afterlife, that in order for our existence and identity to be preserved, so would also our experience and memories. That would be different from like in Platonism, where it's just like you merge with the one and don't have any like individual identity or categories.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think that our memories and our identity would persist.
Yeah, and then wrapping up, we've gone on a lot of different topics on reality and God, intelligence and experience and so forth, of what is in sentient singularity theory, what is the what is the lesson that you take away from that for how you ought to exist.
So I think about what it would be like to be God beyond or prior to, I guess you have to try to find the right words for this kind of thing, but prior to creating multiplicity of sentience, and why he did that, why he created multiplicity. And if all there is sentient beings, and I mean, it's like we feel meaningless sometimes, we feel alone sometimes, but we're never alone and we're never meaningless, because if every instance of creation or every partition of the singular wholeness of sentience that is God has to be an intentional choice by him, it means that every single one of us was intentionally created. And I think that has a lot of implications regarding meaning. And I think meaning would essentially be impact beyond on other sentient beings beyond ourselves. And I think that that's pretty self-evident for all of us. Is when people say I want to be meaningful, usually means like I want to impact others. And God, prior to the creation of multiplicity, was meaningless, but after creation of multiplicity was all meaningful to everyone, the most meaningful. And also God, prior to creation of multiplicity, was truly alone, not just felt lonely, but truly alone. Whereas we can feel lonely, but we're not ever truly alone. I think that both of those things have a lot of things within them to ponder. But the main one would be that we were intentionally put here for a reason, to make a difference, and that our lives are not just our existence is not just an accident. and that there's an intentionality behind it, and that means that there's a value behind each and every one of us. And I think that is a very important so what to consider, and it's kind of universally applicable to our lives, that we're here we were put here intentionally, and it seems physically inevitable that it had to be intentional. It was not an accident.
Yeah, that's really, I think, sums it up. Any closing words, final thoughts, concluding meditations?
Yeah, I guess just think about that, and think about that when it comes to interacting with, I mean, we're in an especially divisive time right now, and I think that it's very helpful to think about that when we're when we're thinking about ourselves, because it's also a very chaotic time for people in terms of personal meaning, but it's also very helpful, I think, and important to think about that concept when it comes to interacting with others around us. So
fantastic. Thank you so much for talking. I think this would be very, very valuable. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Have a great day.
You too.